Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. I'm your host, Karan Takhar, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Bradley Pischea, National Director of the Land and Liberty Coalition, which is part of the Conservative Energy Network. We sit down to discuss the work the coalition is doing in advocating for clean and renewable energy policy and development from a right-of-center standpoint in states around the U.S. We touch on the reasons why Bradley believes clean energy became a partisan issue, how the conversation around clean energy and renewables has shifted over the years, and how the coalition uses a proactive versus reactive approach to communicating with citizens. We discuss the concerns those in typically conservative communities have about the transition to clean energy in their areas, and how developers can speak to community stakeholders in ways that factor in that community-specific needs. This episode highlights the importance of listening to the needs and concerns of those who may live in places that look vastly different from your own, as we all strive towards a cleaner energy future. Thank you for tuning in. I really hope you take away some great insights from my conversation with Bradley. Hello, Bradley. Welcome to the Zenergy Podcast. It is great to have you on, and I really enjoyed hearing you speak a few weeks ago at ACOR. And as soon as I saw you on stage, I was like, I got to get you on the podcast. So really appreciate you taking the time and excited to hear more about your work. So to kick us off, could you just talk a little bit about, I know you're pretty involved with the Conservative Energy Network. And also, of course, now you're spearheading a lot of the efforts at the Land and Liberty Coalition. So can you just give us a sense of the work you're doing these days and how you ultimately got plugged into it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And thanks first of all, for having me on today. Thrilled to do it. Really enjoyed having a conversation with you at that ACOR conference here just a few weeks ago. But yeah, I'm happy to first dive into CEN. So the Conservative Energy Network now is a network of 26 states across the U.S. Advocating for market-based clean energy policy in state capitals, in state regulators, and with governors from a right-of-center framework. So talking about an all-of-the-above approach to energy that is making this something that makes sense for ratepayers, for reliability, for national security, for grid resiliency, and just bolstering America's footing as the energy dominant nation here in the world. And Land and Liberty is a piece of that, a project of the Conservative Energy Network. I lead that team nationally. We've got 13 states within Land and Liberty. And for what the CEN state teams are doing at the national level and the state level, engaging those key policymakers, we're doing that at the local level. So supporting grid scale projects that are coming through and are largely reliant on county or township permitting. We're building support for those projects locally in communities by framing this as an issue around property rights, around national security, rural economic development, rural revitalization in many cases. And it's been great. CEN has existed formally now for 10 years, and Land and Liberty Coalition has been around for about 6. Both got their start in Michigan, and now we're across maybe every region of the U.S. with the exception of the West Coast states. So we've loved doing the work. I've loved being a part of this organization, and I'm really thrilled to be able to be here today and share a little bit more about our work.
I'm looking forward to that. And building off that, what ultimately got you pulled in? How did you get involved with CEN?
Yeah, it's a family story for me, for sure, but then a political one as well. So I got my start in politics. I worked in the Michigan Senate, worked on a number of different races, and for the state house and the state Senate, starting back to like 2014, and loved the political fights. I loved the local work. especially at the state level. I just found a lot of value in doing that, and it made me feel pretty fulfilled. So I did that for some time, and as is the case, campaign burnout's a real thing. Folks work a few cycles, and the craziest among us can do it as a career, but for many, it's not something that's all that sustainable. So, I appreciated being able to work in the Republican caucus in Michigan, worked with some incredible leaders, Senator Dave Hildenbrand and Senator Arlen Meekoff, both in the Michigan State Senate, were two folks that I worked for, and they were fantastic. But all the while, my dad, who had been involved in politics for some time, was working more and more on this energy thing. And as a Republican, he was very passionate about clean energy and realized there was this big gap that for whatever reason, at some point, this had become a real partisan split. And folks on the right had no answer on clean energy other than no. And that's not a sustainable policy position for something that's coming down the line. So it was my dad who actually started CEN many years ago. He kicked off our first Michigan program. Boy, it would have been maybe 2013. And it came off the election cycle in 2018. And it was kind of deciding what I wanted to do next, if it was staying on staff in the Senate, if it was maybe even going back to school. And then this whole land of liberty thing kicked off. And my dad and I had always wanted to find a way to work together. And we saw this as maybe some sort of divine intervention that we might be able to have that opportunity too. And it turned out to be that way. We were able to work together from 2019 until, unfortunately, he passed in 2022. But we were able to have 3 incredible years of working together. And there is that element too, but then even just what clean energy is to me has been so important, that being able to leverage my conservative values to support something that has been so transformative for so many rural communities in many ways that are unique unto themselves. But that's a bit of my origin story and some of the family history therein.
Wow, that's powerful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing. Before diving more into the current work that you're doing, I really think the historical context is extremely important. And you briefly mentioned how clean energy ultimately became a partisan issue 10 years ago, I think you said. I'd love to just dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one to crack. On one hand, it seems like it could be a matter of circumstance. And we saw a lot of these technologies really taking off during the middle of the Obama administration. And so was it just a matter of this was something that at the time made sense, and thus the Obama era policies were supporting these, and then as a result, the natural step for the Republican Party to make at the time was to oppose it, and then it just kind of took off from there? Or if there was something even deeper, it could be something that was at one point that was rooted in maybe market realities, like the fact that at one point clean energy was the less reliable, more expensive option. And I just don't think that conservative viewpoints have necessarily caught up fully to the fact that that's not true anymore, that it is very much competitive on price and competitive on reliability, especially with battery on the scene now. And it's very, very challenging in rural communities because largely the perception on renewables there is what's being talked about in the national zeitgeist, which remains to be this message that renewables aren't reliable, they're maybe not safe, they're not inexpensive, but none of those things are true. And that's been our primary mission, is to right some of those wrongs.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's kind of incredible how much has changed for renewable technology in the past decade. So it might be hard to grasp truly like how much of the cost has declined, the efficiency has increased in technology in general. This is like one of the more incredible transformation stories. And also partially, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, whether there's an element of a lot of these communities feel economically threatened because they're reliant on, for example, coal jobs, whether direct or indirect. And then with that also, they lose some local property taxes when coal plants transition away, which can have some significant impacts on the public services in that area, things like that. So, are you seeing that play out here?
Yeah, it's really regionally dependent. I would say that places like uh, Pennsylvania, we see a fair bit of that because it's a legacy energy production state. We see some of that in Texas even, but a lot of the places where we're engaged, there's not a real replacement that's happening, like you might see in West Virginia, for example, like a real coal mining or coal production state or community. But there still is opportunity. I mean, I look at a place like Wisconsin, where not a big coal mining state, but they were using coal to produce energy for some time. They were able to use the infrastructure from a coal plant that came offline to actually house one of the biggest solar projects in the country. It's not online yet, but because the transmission infrastructure was there, that won't maybe replace all the jobs and all the tax base, but it's better than nothing. And it was a coal project that was slated to come offline either way. So renewables may not be the answer to all of those challenges as our economy changes, as our energy market changes, but renewables can be at least part of that solution.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was on your LinkedIn recently and reading some of the posts that you're putting out there. Very compelling, by the way. And you were talking about how the conversation in one of the posts around community engagement has really evolved over the past few years. Could you talk a little more about that and also what you think has sparked that shift?
Yeah, I think even criticizing my own language that evolved might be a bit generous, because maybe in reality, the community engagement conversation wasn't even really happening a few years ago. That when Land and Liberty started, we were certainly the new kids on the block, supporting development in a lot of these areas, certainly from a right of center perspective, but even a lot of the developers that we saw in and around those areas had no real dedicated community engagement apparatus. But you flash forward 5 years from then, and a lot has changed. That most of them do. That their practices vary, and their efficacy certainly varies too. But I think it was very reactive, which is an unfortunate element of the renewable energy industry, is that it can be very, very reactive at times. So I think we saw our butts getting kicked across these rural communities for a few years, and then realized we need to do something about this. And I think that's why there's been a doubling down, but only because folks have seen it as necessary, not necessarily something that we should be doing. I want to see more proactive style outreach, more proactive build outs of these sorts of community engagement or government affairs teams, as opposed to letting the problem sort of take root and then trying to address it after it's a big, scary monster in front of us.
It's so important. I've been dabbling in the development world, and it's super clear how just practically needed engaging with the community is in order to successfully build a project. Like, how have the concerns shifted from the community over the years? Have you seen any evolution on that front, or are the concerns largely sort of what we've already discussed?
That's a great question. What's interesting is that the concerns, say, about wind and solar, and the unique concerns that folks have about each of those technologies, I haven't seen a lot of shift in the last few years. I mean, not to espouse renewable opposition talking points, but there's always going to be those concerns about property values or health and safety, and some of the other issues that folks might throw around. But what does change is, like, for example, when we came onto the scene in 2019, it was all wind all the time that everybody was talking about. But then through COVID, it really shifted in terms of what we were seeing with mostly solar, and the opposition changes as a result. So, for example, you can farm right up to the base of a wind turbine. You certainly cannot farm in and around a solar project, because agrivoltaics at this point aren't that scaled. But you never really saw concerns about taking up valuable ag land when it came to wind, because its footprint was relatively small. But we're dealing with that concern all over the place on solar. So I think, and nothing has really fundamentally changed. The way that opponents oppose a project locally, it seems like they're operating from a playbook. because I look at a solar project that we may have touched in 2021 in one state versus how a county in another state is handling it now. It's almost the exact same thing. Like, they know what they're doing is working, so why reinvent the wheel?
So what's that playbook?
Oh man, it's get loud, get organized, and espouse as many fearful messages as you possibly can. Many of them are rooted in the tiniest grain of truth. So there's evidence, I say in air quotes, to back it up, but none of it's really real. So the idea is flood the zone, so to speak. Get as many opponents to this thing as possible, and make it appear as though this small, loud band of folks represents the community more broadly. And there is certainly an element of fear and intimidation that comes into that. And so folks who are supportive or even agnostic to the project don't show up to important local meetings or don't involve themselves. But it's a real challenge, and it's an effective one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember at the conference you were talking about how to this organizational component, there was someone who would come from outside of the community and would come into the community in a very strategic way and rile people up. Yet he really didn't have a lot of stake in that community outside of trying to prevent whatever project was occurring in that specific region, which I thought was really interesting. I didn't realize it was that it was organized to that degree.
It is, and I think it's easy for folks to really villainize these outside community agitators and place the blame on them and the alleged fossil fuel money that's flowing to them and providing them support. But the reality is, most communities are poised to oppose something new as opposed to wanting something new, right? I think people generally appreciate the status quo, and you've got to show them that on their balance sheet of tangibles and intangibles, there's a net benefit to something. So we're already kind of playing from behind a little bit. So if somebody can get there first, really make it clear to them that whatever's coming is bad, in this case, a wind or solar project, and give them all the reasons why, that's really just throwing a match onto a pile of tinder. So that's what's happened here. So you need not very much work to have happen in order for this sort of seemingly organic opposition to form up and take hold. And then once that happens, you are basically just trying to catch up the entire time. And it is a very hard race to win when you're already that far behind.
Yeah, going back to the reactive versus the proactive. So what does a proactive approach look like here? And to your point on the balance sheet, in general, what have you found to be the most effective pros for development that the community has been able to relate to?
Yeah, so to your first question, we don't have a whole lot of advantages. But the one advantage that we do have, in whether it be even the development community or the folks that are supporting development, we at least know where we're going. The opposition is generally reacting to that, at least. So I think we need to capitalize more on what advantages we do have. And so if we know where we're going, when, we have the opportunity to jump in there first and start to set the scene and change the narrative before an opposition group can really take hold. So I think that's one thing that we still could be doing better throughout the industry and even in the supportive NGO space, is giving that proactive message, educating communities, engaging with them, talking about what the benefits are. So back to the balance sheet question, some of the things that really move people, one, ideologically, is property rights. That especially when it's coming from a trusted third-party messenger, ensuring that folks understand that this is a business decision for farmers, that this is their land they've used in some instances to grow crops or to raise livestock, but they aren't limited to that just because it's what you as neighbors might want. This is their livelihood, not something that's for your own viewing pleasure. So it's important that we make sure that that's abundantly clear to folks in these communities and make sure that people know that there is an element of personal liberty here too that shouldn't be infringed upon. Beyond that, demonstrating what some of the financial project benefits to the community might look like, whether that be for roads, first responders, schools, libraries, all the public services that a lot of people, I think, take for granted. explaining to them what the financial impact of this project will look like in real terms is critical. I think one mistake we often see with developers is like they'll show up with a financial analysis of what the project might bring to them, but no one knows what the hell that means, right? You see a number, we're going to 10x your county budget. Like, well, what does that mean? Like, let's put that in real terms. I think folks generally don't have a full grasp on what their county budget looks like, for example. So saying, hey, this is the kind of thing that's going to be able to put 3 more sheriffs road patrol out there. We can fund another ambulance. So when you call 911, somebody actually shows up, or we can pave another X number of lane miles out in your county roads. So putting things in tangible real terms so folks know what the actual benefit is, rather than just saying, yeah, we're going to throw $30 million at your county over the course of 30 years. I don't think people fully grasp the massive impact that has.
100%. I was recently at a local hearing, and something you said earlier just popped up in my mind about how the people who will benefit often don't come out to the hearings because I guess agitation often leads to, wanting to project that voice. And then if you're benefiting, it's just like, okay, that's really nice, but I don't really feel super incentivized unless if there's a cohesive effort to get me out there. But again, to your point, developers often are reactive, not proactive in bringing out potentially positive supporters to these, at least at the hearing that I was at. Similarly, there were like 7 people. This was about a real estate development project who were there complaining about the increased traffic. So it's like they would one person would make a claim, and then they would sit down, and then another person would come up, it'd sit down, another person. So it's just like constant negative criticism, which the city council was hearing, whereas the people trying to develop this complex didn't really have stakeholders on their side saying the positive things, which, like you said, would be immense, especially on the funding that could go, also the support to the local businesses. But just thought it was really interesting to see that dynamic unfold. And which leads me to the question for you, have you worked with developers who have brought community stakeholders who would benefit from these projects to these hearings? And in general, like, what does that collaboration look like? How do they approach the stakeholders, and what have you seen to be effective community stakeholders who want to take that stance publicly, which isn't very easy?
Yeah, wow, it's a great question, and it is the most challenging thing here, is finding people who are supportive of a project and turning them out. So the most effective developers that I've seen turn folks out to support projects publicly are the ones that reject the assumption that just because someone should, in air quotes, support a project means that they will. And I think we take the lowest hanging fruit example of being participating landowners in a wind or solar project. Theoretically, they have the most to lose or to gain by this project's success. If it's successful, they get likely a 30-year lease. It's going to pay them a pretty solid passive income, and the benefits that come with that are self-evident. That said, just because someone has signed a wind lease or a solar lease doesn't convert them immediately from farmer to farmer and clean energy champion. There's work that has to be done to get that person from that point to the other. And I think what I've seen from a number of developers is just they sign the lease, and then there is just immediate frustration that they're not engaged, and they're neglecting to educate, to engage, to build trust, to build a relationship, to explain what can be done through this political process and why it's important. That's really often missing. But for the developers that have gone the extra mile to build meaningful relationships, to educate, to explain even how very little effort sorts of engagements from residents can make a huge impact. Something like signing a letter of support, saying I am, farmer X, and I support this project because it will allow me to ensure that I can pass this farm down to my family, as opposed to having to sell it to a corporate farm. That means something, and that's very little work for somebody. But I think a lot of developers have trouble even getting that out of the folks that are participating in their project. And ultimately don't take farmers for granted, I think is something that we should all take some value in.
That's great. That's great. Any other stakeholders in the community who you've seen to be generally receptive to
Mm-hmm.
supporting these projects?
Yeah, labor is a big one as well. And I think that a lot of the same principles apply there. I think that organized labor really appreciates direct, honest kind of conversation about what the development firm can or can't do with a labor agreement or what they intend to do once the project moves into the construction phase. But the message can be, we're going to keep you as informed as we possibly can. We're not going to mislead you. But the fact of the matter is, if you want jobs for your members, this project needs to happen. And then we can talk about what those jobs might look like. And when labor has gotten involved locally on many of these projects, people tend to listen, and they're great at turnout. As an organization, typically local labor organizations do a really good job of mobilizing their members. And so it helps to offset that perceived imbalance of support versus opposition locally.
What are some characteristics of a community that you feel like would reflect to a developer early on in the process? Okay, this one might be a little more challenging to be able to pass a project through.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first thing I would look at is, especially with solar coming on more than it was even a few years ago, and many of the wind fights happening by this point now, 10 or 15 years ago, I think it's important to look at the community's renewable energy history, because some of the same things that a wind developer might have been looking for many years ago are the same things that a solar developer might be looking for now, which is interconnection, available land. And there is quite a bit of overlap in a lot of those states of where a wind project or a solar project might be viable. So know the community's history with renewable energy developments or other developments as well. So if there was a big community organizing push that blocked a wind project in, say, 2012, it probably wouldn't be that hard for this community to spin up the same opposition, and they're likely still going to be opposed to solar or some other new technology that's coming down the line. I hate to say it, but partisanship is certainly an element here. I think we have more challenges in conservative communities than we do in communities that aren't. And that's one of the reasons why we exist, to make sure that folks know that the clean energy environment and the support for it's a big tent. And there are people that are under it because they are climate change activists, and there are people who are under that tent because they want us to be American energy dominant, and they want to make America the country that builds things again. It's a big tent, as I said, and I would say partisanship's a big one. But then finally, just know what the community is. Is it a big community full of large corporate farms, or are there lots of really small lakes where people like to do to vacation, and they've got cottages there, and know sort of what that demographic looks like?
I do want to zoom out macro a little bit, but before doing that, one final question. Thank you for all of this information. It's really illuminating. Like, I would not have thought necessarily to look, which may seem obvious, but to look at projects from the past in the community and see how they did there. So I appreciate all of your insights. Say if a developer wanted to engage your organization, like, what would be the steps? And like, what would be the first few steps that you and the organization take to get the process started with engaging with the county or community?
Yeah. So, I mean, we are out there to support as many clean energy developments as we can. I mean, our first step, as I mentioned, we like to get in there as early as possible. So the first things that we're going to do, build a stakeholder map, do our community research, county analyses, township analyses, determine who the most important folks are. And we like to think of it as a funnel where we start talking with local leaders first, and then sort of build out to develop a grassroots movement. But that's ultimately how we would do it. Be the first persons in the community, try to deliver a message that folks really haven't heard before, because as we're learning more and more, no one has considered, in many of these small communities, clean energy through these lenses. It's definitely a climate change, environmental stewardship type issue, and that's not how we're going to lead. So our message is, whether the climate change debate is happening at all, we're still going to be there because we believe these projects are good, regardless of what its carbon impact might be. So we want to reframe it and start building support through education and sort of reframing that message, and ultimately take those folks that we engage with, prepare them to mobilize for whatever county hearing or public hearing might be upcoming, and support development that way.
Makes a lot of sense. And with only 5, wow, this conversation has flown by. And really want to touch upon this idea that the tent is big, but personally, I feel like the tent should be a lot bigger for something like solar, wind. I mean, some people might not agree with that, but I feel like from a technology standpoint, there are a lot of attributes that solar specifically, because I know a lot more about it than I do wind, has, where you can essentially develop energy capacity almost anywhere where the sun is shining at roughly zero marginal costs. Of course, there are capital costs, but I just think from a pure technology standpoint, there's a lot of versatility that solar has, which for me, of course, I'm a little biased as someone who like loves solar and has a climate podcast. But I just wonder, since you have engaged with communities, many conservative communities, what steps can be taken at a macro level to expand the tent? And where do you feel like the messaging has gone too far?
Yeah, it's getting bigger. I mean, especially our organization being a right of center group, we look for ways to engage with folks on the right of center. And one population that we have found that is really great to engage with has been with younger conservatives, college Republicans, young Republicans. Young conservative groups have a lot of energy, and they see this as being another opportunity for us to take the next step towards America's footing as a world leader on energy and continue to hold that mantle. So that's been great. So I would say the umbrella is bigger than we think. I think there are assumptions we should steer clear of. And then another one that I have found to be true almost universally is that folks aren't opposed to solar in principle. They're opposed maybe to solar on farmland. They're opposed to solar in large scale. They're opposed to maybe solar replacing other energy forms that they find more trustworthy. But when we reframe this as all of the above, as demand for energy growing, that this is just one more way that we can create energy, that's when things get a little bit easier. And we've got the opportunity to reframe the conversation on sort of the scale of it and where it's being put, because that again comes back to that property rights issue. But I think maybe the optimist in me says that the tent is already big and getting bigger, even maybe organically, but we'll continue to help make our push to grow the tent even more.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, Bradley, and for sharing your insights. I certainly learned a lot. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's been a blast. I hope to be back again at some point.
Definitely. Thanks so much for checking out the Zenergy Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate and subscribe to the podcast. It would mean so much to me and the rest of the team. We release episodes every Thursday, so stay tuned for all new episodes featuring industry leaders building a cleaner, greener future for us all. See you next time.